Good afternoon. It's been a very informative afternoon. I'm sure this panel will be part of that. I'm Katrina Vanden Heuvel. For 20 years, I've edited The Nation magazine, America's oldest weekly, founded in 1865, 150 years ago. And The Nation has repeatedly championed ideas originally labeled heretical, only to see them accepted as common sense a generation later. So today, when it comes to coverage of the Ukraine crisis, we believe it is vital to publish alternative views and to drive them into our national discussion, international discussion. My husband thinks I'm silly when I do this, but full disclosure, my husband is Stephen F. Cohen. He's been writing for The Nation for 30 years, long before I became editor. In these last 2 years, his work, I think, has been critical, not only for engaging, as our panelists have, the conventional orthodox non-wisdom, but also in inspiring a younger generation of journalists and thinkers and scholars to begin to write for The Nation and other places, and to understand that there is space for that. But all of you in this room know that these are tough times, rough times for those in the media who challenge that orthodox conventional narrative on the Ukraine conflict. Indeed, as Steve and I wrote in The Nation last year, we argued that no modern precedent exists for the complicity of the American political media elite in this disastrous policy toward Ukraine and Russia. All of you may have considered, and The Nation was very involved with this, that considerable congressional and mainstream media debate, even protest, were voiced during the run-up to the U.S. wars in Vietnam and Iraq, and more recently proposed wars against Syria and Iran. So why is it that not only the mainstream media, the media that defines the parameters of what is possible or permissible in this Beltway city, but also, I'd argue, the liberal media, the so-called liberal media, has failed to provide more rigorous alternative reporting and analysis. Is it a failure to remember history? Is it fear? Most of America's political and media class seem to share a common DNA, call it a fear gene, that if you challenge that orthodoxy, as Bob Perry has written, you challenge that groupthink, you will have your patriotism. If not your sanity questioned, you will be marginalized and vilified. Our longtime contributing editor, the great writer Gore Vidal, once called the United States of amnesia. And it may be that the lack of history, the lack of a historical perspective, something which these panelists do not have a problem with, has influenced what we read today. Think of the fact that how much of the media, many of you will remember this, bought into the narrative that the Yeltsin's 90s were a glorious time of democracy and reform in Russia. And almost along the way, in a kind of prefiguring of the shameful media actions today, the US mainstream media simply excluded American and Russian views on the 90s that did not conform to the establishment narrative. And today, the very same influentials who helped perpetuate those false narratives of the 90s are back, and back with a vengeance. Think of Strobe Talbott, head of the so-called liberal institution Brookings, who has led the way for sending of lethal weapons to Ukraine and is at the top of the list of Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's list to be Secretary of State. Steve spoke, I think all of us here will today, about the failure to challenge US triumphalism toward Russia. That is deeply embedded in the media. There's also that ongoing debate, we'll talk about it here, I'm sure, the nexus between the political class and the mainstream media. Who shapes? Does the media coverage shape or reflect the political agenda, or vice versa? Probably both, depending on the subject. But everyone on this panel has written, I think in different ways, that by so unequivocally accepting the official US government and European version of events, by hewing to a one-sided narrative, assigning single sole culpability to Russia, failing to provide history, nuance, let alone complexity, has played a key role in fueling the conflict and putting this country at risk of conflict, war with Russia. Again, it is astonishing to me, where I sit, that there's been such little challenging of these views. And there was reference, I think Ed spoke of Fox earlier. Two or three of our former editors are at MSNBC. there has not been challenging of this narrative there. The New York Times has bought into this for the most part. I mean, the Washington Post I write a weekly column for is essentially, I think Bob Perry, tell me if I'm wrong, I mean, it's like Pravda on the Potomac. It is a regime change newspaper. And that is very dangerous for the security of our country. So let me just say, I hope the panel will engage with how this crisis offers an opportunity. It may, out of crisis comes opportunity. Does the internet have potential to challenge the establishment gatekeepers if it's used smartly and intelligently? Now, caveat, many of the worst examples of coverage in the last year, not Bob Perry's site, of course, or Ray McGovern's or any others, have been sites which have played in pushing this narrative. The demonization of Putin, as Steve spoke of, has been at the heart of this. It is far simpler to demonize Putin than come up with an informed analysis. And again, right, left, center has bought into this. I think there's a possibility of a transpartisan coalition of thinkers, journalists, writers. We have someone at The Nation who writes also for the National Interest and the American Conservative, who is now in Donbass and has done some good reporting. Let me end, before I introduce the panelists, by stating what I think is the key point. Why do we have a panel on the media at this forum? American journalistic malpractice is dangerous for U.S. national security. It is abetting the making of unwise, reckless Russia policy in Washington and making it virtually impossible politically for those in this city to think in more open ways. Media coverage of Russia, Ukraine, better coverage is urgently needed, both for our own democracy and our security, but it will take courage, because the American media establishment, like the political one, does not like to contemplate criticism or to consider puncturing what is often a suffocating consensus. This afternoon, we have a very strong panel, supremely well positioned to address the question of the media, the Ukraine conflict, alternatives. How do we find alternatives? How do we bring forward alternatives? What stories need to be reported? Why is it that we have this failure of the mainstream media and other elements? Let me introduce very briefly in order, and I've asked each of them to speak about 10 to 12 minutes and then open it up for Q&A with you. Robert Perry, he sent me a very modest bio. He is someone who broke one of the most important stories in this country's history, the Iran-Contra story, broke it for the Associated Press and Newsweek in the 80s. He's a longtime investigative reporter. In 1995, he started the first web-based investigative magazine, ConsortiumNews.com, which I trust all of you have been to. He writes prolifically and in very important ways. His latest book is America's Stolen Narrative. Patrick Smith is the foreign affairs columnist at Salon, a correspondent abroad for nearly 30 years, chiefly for the Far Eastern Economic Review, the International Herald Tribune, and the New Yorker. His most recent book, Time No Longer, America After the American Century, came out in mid-2013 from Yale University Press. Ray McGovern. Ray served as a CIA analyst from the administration of John F. Kennedy to that of George H.W. Bush. In January 2003, Ray helped create an organization I'm sure many of you know about. If you don't, go check it out, Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, to expose the way intelligence was being falsified to justify war on Iraq. Ray's opinion pieces have appeared in many leading newspapers. His website reporting is posted first on ConsortiumNews.com. We've got some interlocking networks here, as well as RayMcGovern.com. And Martin Siff is a national columnist for the online Post-Examiner newspaper chain and a senior fellow of the American University of Moscow. He's received 3 Pulitzer Prize nominations for international reporting and has reported from 70 countries and covered 12 wars. If we cannot get some intelligence and enlightenment from this panel, I don't know where we will get it from. Thank you.
Me first?
You first, Bob, and then...
Well, thank you, Katrina. I appreciate that introduction. I guess I should start off by just saying that I've been a journalist in this city since 1977. I've worked for the Associated Press and Newsweek and Public Broadcasting's Frontline, as well as starting ConsortiumNews.com and as an investigative website. And I have to say that in all these years, I can't think of a time when there has been a groupthink as single-minded as the one we've seen over the past year or so regarding the Ukraine crisis. And this is not to say that there weren't some pretty awful and destructive groupthinks that preceded this one. But I've just never seen a moment when so little questioning has occurred about something as important as whether or not there will be a second Cold War, whether there'll be a possible nuclear confrontation between the United States and Russia that might conceivably end all life on the planet. There's been a cavalier attitude, and not just where you might expect it on some of the TV shows, but you've seen it at the very heart of the most prestigious news organizations in the United States. I would say most particularly the New York Times, but certainly the Washington Post and others fall into this. Now, as I said, I came to Washington in 1977, and that was a time when it's hard to say that was a golden age of American journalism, but it was a time when the American Press Corps asked tough questions, did not accept easy government answers, when the press broke through on many government lies, whether it be the Pentagon Papers, the publication of the secret history of the Vietnam War, whether it was not accepting Richard Nixon's blasé explanations for the Watergate break-in, whether it was penetrating into the Central Intelligence Agency's secrets, the so-called family jewels. And so we had seen how the American Press Corps could work and how, I would say, our founding fathers envisioned it. This is not to say things were perfect, they were far from it, but it was a time when the press understood, I think, the basic responsibility they had to the American people, the implicit agreement that was in the First Amendment, that it's our job to ask those kinds of questions. And even if people don't like us for doing it, even if they call us names for doing it, that's still our job. And there's also this idea that I learned when I was at the AP and even before that there are usually two sides to a story. That you shouldn't assume just one side has all the truth, the other side is completely dishonest. I'm not saying that doesn't happen from time to time, but in my experience, there usually, almost always, is a second side to a story, something that journalists should want to know. I used to interview some of the more despicable people on the face of the earth when I was working for AP and Newsweek and PBS. I spent time with Roberto Dobusan, head of some of the death squads in El Salvador. My job wasn't to judge him. My job was to figure out what made him tick. And I think what we've seen lost in this era now, where we've come to the situation in Ukraine, is that from the very beginning, this was presented in a one-sided way. That the anti-Yanukovych forces had all the truth and honor and decency, and the forces on the side of Yanukovych were evil and corrupt and rotten and had to be overthrown. And there was all simple black and white, almost cartoon-like. And that just isn't the way the world is. And when I started seeing this, I was even surprised, even after the periods of the groupthink around the weapons of mass destruction on Iraq, but at least then there were some voices, a few voices, speaking up saying that the intelligence wasn't that good, that we should look more carefully, even though the major news organizations failed the American people terribly, and they particularly failed the American soldiers who were sent over there to fight a war on false pretenses, with 4,500 of them not coming back alive and many coming back severely wounded. And the American people shelling out $1 trillion or so. But okay, so we get to this issue of Ukraine, and I'm seeing basically the same thing, except even more so, more locked in. And what that's led to has been a failure to ask the hard questions and to push the US government for answers. I know I've only a few minutes, but for instance, there's the case of the Malaysian airline Flight 17 that was shot down on July 17th of last year. Obviously, there are many people with very immediate suspicions of who did it, how it happened, but we really didn't know. It was very interesting, even though the immediate conclusion was that the pro-Russian or the ethnic Russian rebels in the east had shot it down using a sophisticated missile provided by the Russian government, I was told pretty quickly from people reaching out from the U.S. intelligence community that there were other aspects to this that weren't being taken seriously. But there was a rush to judgment. John Kerry, within 3 days, went on all the talk shows that Sunday morning and basically said the ethnic Russian rebels did it and that the Russian government was complicit. I was hearing sort of that the U.S. intelligence community was going off in different directions on that. They still hadn't had a chance to evaluate all the evidence. On July 22nd, 5 days after the event, the Director of National Intelligence released a little white paper, very sketchy, based mostly on social media, also pointing the finger generally at the rebels and blaming the Russians, but not very conclusively, with a lot of things left up in the air. And I kept hearing from inside the community, the intelligence community, that they were finding other things, other suspects. And what became really amazing to me was that at that point, when there were 298 people who had been killed, a serious crime being committed, the US government went basically silent. It wasn't pursuing this issue, at least publicly. I'm told privately, but in the classified world, there was a great deal of progress being made. But this was not being shared with the American people. It was not being shared with the world public. It was not being shared with the investigators into this serious crime. When I checked just last week or so, when I was trying to, because the Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, Victoria Nuland, gave testimony in Congress in which she suggested again that the Russians were responsible for this. I tried to contact the State Department. They would not respond. I contacted the CIA. They said call the DNI. I called the DNI or emailed the DNI. And the DNI office very politely got back to me and said, well, here's our latest work on this. It was the July 22nd report they'd put out 5 days after the event. It wasn't credible. This is not a credible response. We know that the United States government, with all its intelligence apparatus, knows a great deal more about this crime, but is for some reason holding back that information. And it falls to the American press, or should fall to the American press, to push the US government on these things. Not simply go with it, go with the flow, accept what was sort of believed back in the first few days after this terrible event, but find out what the US government knows. And why is it not helping to bring whoever was responsible to justice? So there are any number of these kinds of issues that have involved this issue of Ukraine, and where the American press corps simply has not done its job right. It hasn't asked the questions. It simply has acted pretty much as a propaganda conveyor belt. The State Department or the U.S. Embassy in Kiev puts out material, and the American press publishes it. And that's not the way it's supposed to work. And frankly, it was not the way it used to work. As I say, there was no golden age of American press, but there was a time when we actually did our jobs in a more serious way than we're doing them now. And on an issue like this, where the potential of a confrontation, what one of our writers, William Polk, described as a Cuban Missile Crisis in reverse, and Mr. Polk knows what he's talking about since he was one of John Kennedy's diplomats handling the Cuban Missile Crisis back in the 1960s. He now sees this as a potential to have that kind of serious confrontation between two nuclear powers. And if our lives and the lives of our kids and our grandkids are going to be put at risk that way, you would think at least that the New York Times and the Washington Post and the rest of the major US news media would do their jobs and not just accept whatever they're told by the US government, but press for real answers, push the questions, and act the way I think our founding fathers would have liked the American press to act. Thank you.
Bob? Everything they said, right? It's easy and difficult to follow. People with that kind of insight. Katrina said something that makes it a lot easier for me to say something I want to say this afternoon. Pravda on the Potomac. I tend to think more about the Hudson River, but we'll leave that for another time. I'd like to answer or address the question of why things are the way Katrina described them, and now Bob, and see if we can come to some at least tentative conclusions. My own, if not the headline, the subhead, is why aren't journalists doing their job? I tend to think the job's become more or less impossible to do, and I'll try to explain that. I want to start with the relationship of American media to power, okay? Power. Different kinds of power. You can refract this through. You can have corporate power because of the ownership structures that have arisen from the 80s and 90s. Financial power because these are publicly listed companies, right? But I'd like to leave those aside and stay with political power, right? I think American media have had an unhealthy relationship with power since 1898. No coincidence. Our first advance into the imperial adventures, right? We often say you can have democracy or you can have empire, but you cannot have both at the same time. Maybe it is so with the press as well. You can have a healthy press, or you can have imperial ambition, but you can't have both. Just maybe, okay? That's 1898. We had, in the Cold War, a big turning point. The press had a very serious decision to make for itself. We all know, or many of us, the climate that obtained during that time. I don't have any trouble. I was young, alive, but young. I have no trouble imagining how difficult these sort of decisions were, but I don't excuse the decisions that were made nonetheless. The press, as with the scholars, present company accepted, and others, ran for cover. And it's one thing if you're in some kind of corporate position or whatever and you take cover because you're worried about your job. If you're a journalist, you have other responsibilities beyond the responsibilities you have toward yourself. You have civic responsibilities. If you don't want to fulfill them, go do something else. This was a very serious moment for the American press. I dwell upon it for a moment because I think the American media had a very bad Cold War, and we've never gotten over it. We've never gotten over it. We had an interim of a decade or so during which we could have tried. I say we because I was around then, hacking away. We didn't rise to the occasion. In 2001, we had another decision, not unlike the one we had in the 50s, McCarthy and all that. And we did the same thing again, right? We bent to power. We reconfirmed an already unhealthy relationship with political power, right? We repudiated any notion. I used lecturing in universities. You trot out the phrase fourth estate. You have to explain this to journalism school graduates now. They don't even know what it means. It's so antiquated, right? Absolutely no notion whatsoever as journalism as an independent pole of power with a sovereignty all its own. We bargained it away in the access game. I assume you all know what I mean by that, and in any number of other different ways, right? Ukraine, I think, is at least of the magnitude of our Cold War bad decision and our 2001 bad decision, possibly worse. I think in this period, quantitative becomes qualitative. I think the function of media in this country, we should not any longer be misled by ownership structures such as we have them. Informally, effectively, I think we're looking at a situation where American media function as some kind of state-supervised institution. If you think that's an exaggeration, I will defend it. The New York Times editors do not go to Washington, the White House, state, Intel, what have you, once or twice. You read about it. Bill Keller consults with the administration, or Jill Abrams. You read about it once or twice, that's shocking enough, and then the story goes on, you start untying the string, and they're doing it all the time. SOP. It's not acceptable. It's not acceptable, and we have to ask why this is. I'm going to use a phrase that some of you may find a little offensive. I welcome all uniformed officers, but good enough they're not here to hear this. I think we are in some approximation of a late imperial phase in this country. Every time I hear indispensable country and all the rest of it, and the chest-out assertions of various senators, it tells me the exactly opposite of what it is supposed to convey. We're on our back foot. We're very weak. We don't know how to conduct ourselves in the 21st century. We have 21st century notions of, and no imaginations. I think deep in our guts, the best of us understand that. So a certain kind of desperation arises, and the narrative becomes less and less plausible. Now, combine that with the dysfunctional relationship, and that's a kind word, between the press and power, and this is what I mean by a job that's no longer doable. These people have to get out there in the bureaus in Moscow and elsewhere and advance a story, a narrative, that simply doesn't work, right? It doesn't hold any water whatsoever unless we suspend all notions of disbelief, right? So that's why I think we have in Ukraine a much, much worse situation. And I think it's why one of the major devices deployed over the last year is what I used to call in my journalism lectures, the power of leaving out, right? The power of leaving out. You cannot go to the Times and identify outright lies. I must add, very easily. You actually can, but that's not the main event. The main event is what they are not reporting. One, context. You have to be conscientiously careless, if that's not a contradiction, to omit the vast acreage of context in this Ukraine situation. These people are in Moscow. They can't put some post-Soviet context in, some post-Cold War context before that, right? They can't put some, the context of American ambition during the American century, which I described, which I consider happened was 1898 to 2001. They can't put that in. Why? Other things left out. Certain significant features, I think we all know them, the American role in the events of late 2013, early 2014, that kind of thing. I'd like to read more about the activities of NGOs in Russia. Why? Why don't I read that? You can read it, but not in our media. And then vast aspects of the story that are kind of plotty, but very interesting. The Ukrainian economy is an absolute tragedy, right? An absolute, a humanitarian tragedy. You know, the Greeks talk about a humanitarian crisis. Greece is the Klondike compared to Ukraine. If you read you got to read the granular sort of Bloomberg commodities reporters and bond analysis and stuff like that. You know, Ukraine's paying 35% for bond debt. That's pretty bad. I've got a 2-minute note here. I'll wrap it there. I think these are the reasons we have a situation that, in my consideration, is a certain point of no return. I'll end with this thought. Alternative media, alternative narratives. I'm not quite sure I'm comfortable with this word alternative anymore, because what people like Bob Parry are doing is not an alternative to anything. The media we are discussing, they have one thing that nobody at this table has, and that is projection. They have infrastructure. They can push it out there. That's means. That's not anything else, right? That doesn't make it the primary narrative. I think we are at the very beginning, I would say, of a process whereby the burden placed on what we now call alternative media increases very significantly to the point where we can dispose of these terms and figure out another way to call ourselves. Thanks.
Good afternoon. I want to thank Ed and Katrina for inviting me to be on this panel. I feel very honored to be with these distinguished truth tellers. That's what we're talking about, isn't it? Telling the truth. Okay, now let me test this audience. How many have heard of Kapustin Yar? Aha, okay. What is Kapustin Yar? That's where you launch test missiles, right? Sari Shagan? That's where they come down. One was launched or on the 18th of March and announced yesterday with great fanfare, a very accurate missile that can avoid detection by missile defense. The side story, which is not to leave this room, is that it almost hit a major housing area of the National Endowment of Democracy. Just missed, just missed. It's in Kazakhstan, of course, but the NED is all over the place. It's encouraging democracy, in case you haven't heard. Why am I mentioning this? Well, I used to focus on Kapustin Yar and so forth when I was leading the Soviet Foreign Policy Branch at CIA. We paid really close attention to this, especially in the time leading up to the strategic arms limitation talks. And I had the good fortune to be in Moscow in May of 1972 when all those agreements were signed, particularly the treaty. The treaty dwarfed all the other agreements in significance since it was the primary stabilizing factor. The anti-ballistic missile treaty, squandered, sort of said not in effect anymore by George W. Bush. Well, I think Star Wars is worth sort of focusing on, because I was there when Ronald Reagan was really taken with this, and he was so taken by, well, let's face it, it's the biggest corporate welfare operation in the history of the United States of America. There are scientists here that know a lot more than I do, but the ones that I respect tell me it's never going to work, unless you want to make it the largest corporate welfare system in our history. So why do I mention that? Well, Putin can't be sure it won't work. And what he sees is not only this national missile defense, but he sees all these ships and so forth. Bobby Gates was real clever. You know, he says in his book, you know, the Poles and the Czechs, they're getting kind of wobbly on anti-ballistic missiles, so put them on ships. And somebody said, well, won't the Russians object to that? He said, well, I've never really lost much sleep out of pleasing the Russians. Okay? So that's the attitude. call it hubris, call it arrogance, we don't really take into account. We don't have to take into account. We haven't, at least for the last 20 years, but now we do. Now we do big time. Because what really matters is what Putin and his colleagues there in the Kremlin look at when they look at things like national or missile defense, period. Now, who can tell me what Putin said last spring about the reasons why Crimea was annexed to Russia proper? What did he say? Anybody? Just shout it out. Okay. Well, actually, you know, in a substantive way, what he said was this in a major speech. You know, I didn't want NATO taking over Ukraine, but even more important, I wasn't about to let Ukraine slip away because of missile defense systems. This is what really bothered me. This is what worried me. And this, of course, is what Medvedev raised with President Obama before the last election. And Obama was overheard saying what? Do you remember? Well, first let me get elected, then we'll deal with that, right? Well, he's been elected, folks. He's been around for 2 more years. When's he going to deal with this? Well, what I'm trying to say here is this is a real problem for the Russians, and the ABM treaty revocation is really a very sore point. Now, the other thing, of course, is the I was going to say the National Intelligence Endowment for Democracy, and that would have been a bad slip because the CIA covert action staff really has sort of transmogrified into the National Endowment for Democracy. Who do you think dispensed those $5 billion, with a B, huh? $billion for satisfying Ukraine's aspirations toward the West? Aspirations toward the West. Wow, you know? So the NED makes no bones about what it's all about, and Gershman himself has said, look, this is what we're doing here. Russian democracy, this is a quote from something he wrote about 15 months ago, Russian democracy can also benefit from the process of Ukraine's choice to join Europe because it will accelerate the demise of Russian imperialism. Russians, too, face a choice. And Putin may find himself on the losing end, not just of the near abroad, but in Russia itself, okay? Now, you read that congressional resolution that was passed, I think, yesterday or the day before, and you'll see it has to do with facing down Putin domestically as well as his so-called aggression. So this is real. Putin doesn't have to be paranoid. If I were Putin, I would be really, really wondering what's going on. The more so, since, you know, an element of trust is necessary here. And how can Putin trust a serial liar? I refer to John Kerry. I mean, he's been caught so many times lying. Now, you wouldn't find that very much in the Washington Post, the New York Times, but, you know, I don't have time to go into all the lies he's told, but first and foremost, there was that push toward war with Syria. And this was a big divide here. The end of August, early September 2013, Kerry, he said 35 times in a press conference at the State Department on the 30th of August, Bashar al-Assad has been behind these chemical weapons attacks, and we have to, you know, that's a red line, you know what we have to do. And the engines were rolling on the French fighter bombers. The Israelis had been told, get up your fences, we're gonna punish Bashar al-Assad. And what changed that? 2 things. The Russians gave the British samples of the sarin that they had collected, okay? And they weren't the sarin. They were homemade sarin, okay? You can make them, and I'll give you the manual, okay? They're homemade sarin, and they weren't from Syrian government army stocks, okay? No one knew that better than the Russians. And the British came to General Dempsey and said, you know, General Dempsey, you ought to tell the president it's going to come out that these weren't the Syrian government attacks. And General Dempsey went to the president and said, look, you know, the UN inspectors are coming back in 2 days. I'm going to be asked, it's inevitable, why we couldn't wait for the UN inspectors to come back from Damascus to tell us what they found out. And Mr. President, I'm going to have to say, it beats the hell out of me. Go ask the president. Meanwhile, on another track, Mr. Putin was pulling Mr. Obama's chestnuts out of the fire by saying to him, and keeping Kerry out of this, look, Mr. President, we've talked to the Syrians. They're willing to give up all their chemical weapons for destruction. And as we speak today, they've all been destroyed, except some primitive World War I chlorine, I suppose. Okay, well, I just would, cite what's going on in terms of the propaganda warfare here. We have General Philip Breedlove, right? He says we need a new information warfare to expose the false narrative. Now, I'll tell you what the false narrative is, folks. I'll give you an example. In the Bronx, we say, I'll give you a for instance. Okay, here's a for instance. I was at a very progressive gathering where a professor was holding forth on various things, and she said, I'm so proud of my 9-year-old son. He came home from Sunday school with a poster he did. It said, Mr. Putin, have you never heard thou shalt not kill? I looked around at all my progressive colleagues. Yeah. So I raised my hand. I said, now, what's the reference here? Oh, Crimea, of course, Crimea. So I said, well, how many people do you suppose were killed in Crimea? He said, well, hundreds, thousands, I don't know exactly. I said, would you believe no? Nobody? Yeah. So that's how bad it is. Washington Post, it starts on February 23rd. On February 23rd, Putin convened his chief advisors and decided to seize Crimea, okay? No mention of February 22nd. Hello, what happened on February 22nd? 83%, took a poll of my friends, don't know what happened on February 22nd. The coup d'etat arranged by us, Nuland, Kerry, and the rest of them, which caused all this turmoil. So what I'm saying here is we really need to fix that, and the best way to do that, I think, is to face up to the fact that, well, I have a great devotion to Martin Luther King Jr., and one of the things that he said just a week before his famous speech on Vietnam was this: those who love peace must organize as effectively as those who love war. Now, I look out here and I see all above average people. It's sort of like Lake Wobegon. We're all above average. At least we're smart enough to figure this out. Now, what we have to do is, in my view, create something here. Gil is really at work, something internationally. We need something here in Washington, in New York, where C-SPAN will go and say, well, okay, we got somebody from AEI. Where are we going to go to get the other point of view? In my view, there isn't that kind of institute, or what we could do it, virtually. But there has to be some sort of structure here. There has to be some sort of organization to make it as effectively as those who love war. And I suppose the other point that I will say is that, if we don't do that, smart as we are, and energetic as we are, and as erudite as we are, and how wonderful analysis we do, if we don't do the next step and get it possible for C-SPAN and other people to call us, then, as one fellow once said, the fault, dear Brutus, is not in the stars, it's in ourselves. Thank you very much.
I never heard of an Irishman who didn't want to speak from the highest position he could get away with. I am Irish, so anyway, first of all, a horror lesson from history, a brief story, hardly known. In 1911, the British Parliament passed an updated version of the Official Secrets Act. It was in practice what Harry Truman, arguably one of our most overrated presidents, did when he created the national security state in 1947. It institutionalized over the previously entirely independent British press the very subtle but skillful manipulation of government control. And there were dozens of independent newspapers in London alone, let alone 2 or 3 competing ones in every major world centre. 3 years later, Britain went to war with Germany, a totally avoidable war. It's relevant to mention here an outstanding new book by a great Australian academic. We've got some Australian heroes here in this delivery. Douglas Newton, The Darkest Days. I recommend it to all of you. It came out in the last few months. How avoidable the British entry into war in 1914 was. How avoidable. First point. So Britain goes to war. And for the next 4 years, the narrative is dominated by a single press lord who owns the Times of London and the most popular tabloid newspapers in the world. Is this starting to sound familiar? Alfred Northcliffe, who owns the Daily Mail. And today, by the way, the Daily Mail is still the 3rd most read newspaper website on earth. Some things never change, right? Cheap patriotism, lots of pin-ups and lots of gossip about the Kardashians never fails. Right? For 4 years, the British public are told, the driving force from those 2 newspapers, but everybody else keeps it up, that the British generals in World War I are military geniuses. 1 million British boys are killed, another 1.5 million are seriously injured on the level of catastrophic injuries from our survivors, from our war fighters in Iraq today. As a result of World War I, 1 in 3 of every British male between age 18 and 45 in 1914 dies in the war or dies 20 to 40 years before their time. When I was growing up in Britain in the 1950s, there were still lots of genteel tea shops and a vast excess of lonely spinster ladies filling Britain. They were known as the 2 million. They were the 2 million ladies who died before their husbands or the loves of their lives could even meet them because they had been killed in World War I. And that is the price that was paid then for the suppression of truth and of a free media. Right? I think I have your attention. Now, I actually disagree very strongly with one member of the panel, with Patrick. Of course, there is an intimate relationship between journalism and power, because journalism is a way for power to interact and convince people. But when you have a healthy media, this is mediated. I can give you many examples where the media 100 years ago and 50 years ago and 80 years ago completely missed major stories. The New York Times was more culpable in 1931 than it is today. They were Holocaust deniers. They did not deny the extermination of the Jewish people in Europe in the 1940s. It was actually well reported in the New York Times, but in inside pages. But they did, the correspondent in Moscow totally denied the genocide of the Ukrainian people in the Holodomor from 1929, the famine genocide, to 1932, which killed up between 3 million to 10 million people. And the man who wrote that, Mr. Duranty, Walter Duranty, was awarded the Pulitzer Prize, and to this day the New York Times and Columbia University shamefully refuse to strip him posthumously of that prize. Shameful. Shameful. So this is nothing new. But at the same time, it works the other way. In 1968, Walter Cronkite, the embodiment of the media establishment, comes back from Vietnam after the Tet Offensive, and he, even while he's out there, he goes on screen while the U.S. Embassy is still not being cleared of terrorists, and he basically tells the American people on CBS, and they run it, the war is lost. And Lyndon Johnson, a giant figure in both his strengths and his appalling weaknesses, but no fool politically, to put it mildly, turns to his colleagues and says, we have lost the war, because if I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America. So it's not true that empire blots out truth. It tries to. We have a much bigger and more pervasive problem today. We have the collapse of the great journalistic culture of the United States and of the Western world. the disintegration of it. And in the remaining 5 minutes, I'll list the 6 points, gallop through them, and we can talk afterwards at leisure, or you can have questions on it. First of all, we have a generation of reporters who have the arrogance of the hyperpower. They've grown up since 1989. They don't have a sense of a world with limits, a world of complexity, a world of 7 billion human beings that the American army and the American government and most of all the American media and its pundits, God help us, cannot control. Cannot control. You can say anything you like from your enchanted bubbles in Washington and New York. It doesn't change the dynamics of what's happening in Ukraine or Iran or the rise of China or many other things. And that leads to point 2. I was still of a generation where you were only respected, at least among your peers, if you covered the world, if you'd actually knocked around the world a bit, if you'd been places, if you'd been in an unpleasantness or two. And in my personal case, this was compounded for the fact that I am from Northern Ireland, and I lived working professionally in a home city which was filled with terrorism and civil war in the late 1970s and early 1980s, when I was still there, starting out at a very low level, at the lowest imaginable level in journalism. And believe me, it's different. We despised the gung-ho British young correspondents from the Times and the Daily Telegraph who came in, and they basically had a hunting, shooting, fishing view of the war. You would go out hunting for the IRA with a Special Air Service, like you would go on a fox hunt, or you would go shooting peasants, and the bad guys would get shot, and we'd get nice stories about it, splashed on page 1 of the Telegraph. But if you were living in Belfast at the time, and you had to cover the paramilitary gang leaders, and be polite to them and smile at their jokes, when you were knowing you were laughing at the jokes of people who killed with their own hands and tortured with their own hands, it's a very different kind of war. You get a very different perception of war, and the kind of ugliness that automatically comes out of wars. Anybody who's been a serious foreign correspondent gets at least something of that. Something of that. One of the reasons there's been such a high loss of stringers in Syria and what have you now is, like that poor fellow young Stephen Sokolov, they send these poor young fools out and they're naive, they don't know what they're getting into, they have no street smarts, there are no more experienced people around to tell them, don't go looking for Al-Qaeda or ISIS, because if you go looking for them, and you're obviously American and even more obviously Jewish American, you'll find them all right. And that'll be the last thing you do. I mean, nobody told these poor kids anything like that. They go out there to make the world a better place, and then they're amazed when they get kidnapped and decapitated years later. You need to have professionals doing this kind of thing, people who, and even then, the best ones like Marie Colvin or Auntie Shadid will still die, but at least they know the risks. And I think the loss of people like that is irreplaceable. It's irreplaceable also because of another level of ignorance, the collapse of the American education system. There is no give and take. You have SAT scores, you have preferred tests. I see my kids all going through the system. Nobody is taught to question. There was more questioning in the Soviet Union, where everyone knew the system was a lie. Here, nobody has the conception of questioning. But these are the kids who become staffers on Capitol Hill, producers for all the media outlets. Most of these people who will hire a talking head to speak 2 minutes on any American media news outlet, they're in their 20s. They know no history. They've not been taught the concept of history. They have the attention span of a flea. They want someone who will come in and give them simple certainties for 2 minutes and not rock the boat. A personal experience from just a couple of months ago, when I ran foreign op-ed coverage. Oh, sorry, thank you. Sure, 2 minutes. At UPI. One of my columnists was Helen Caldicott, who set up International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, which won the Nobel Prize. Really, it's Helen's prize, but Helen, of course, another Australian hero, insists it's the organizations. She gave a speech on Ukraine and the threat of nuclear war at the National Press Club. The Press Club advertised the meeting. I went wearing the very tiny resources of the Post-Examiner online newspapers. I was the only American journalist there. There were 6 people in the room. And the only other working journalist was a nice 22-year-old girl, an American girl who was a stringer for RT, for Russia Today, right? And that was the only coverage there was of a Nobel Peace Prize winner at the National Press Club warning of the threat of nuclear war in Ukraine. And that is what we are up against. I used to give lectures, if any of you can hire me for most modest sum, I still will, on the rise and fall of international broadcast journalism in the United States. It starts very late. It only starts from scratch with Murrow and Schauer covering the Anschluss, Hitler's occupation of Austria in 1938. And by the 1990s, it's already dying. One last point. Patrick mentioned, how do we get the kids you have to get the people in the bureaus in Moscow and Beijing and Cairo to get on their feet and cover the story. There are no bureaus in Moscow or Beijing or anywhere else. They've all been liquidated in the name of saving money. There was no money in it. The New York Times and the Washington Post are the only news organizations that even pretend to have any kind of experienced foreign coverage anywhere. And in Moscow, even before this crisis, the best New York Times people don't go to Moscow as they did in my time, or Washington Post people. The best people cover the Middle East still, cover Asia, cover China. There's nobody competent left covering Moscow from American media. And the old media culture has collapsed, and we have to start from scratch. And not easy. One last very quick word of optimism, and that is the very thing that people are pessimistic about, I am optimistic about. The rise of antiwar.com on the left, the rise of Breitbart News on the right. The more chaos we have in the media, the more upstarts we have in the media, the more there will be opportunities for everybody who questions the accepted narrative to speak. I mean, what Bob is doing with Consortium News is a classic example, and heroic, and I think in terms of who you reach, and not how much money you make, but who you reach, you're a great success story. Charles Bowson and Russia Inside are the same. We have people in this room who are actually already producing the answers to the problems we are discussing. Thank you.
Because time is of the essence, I want to turn it over to the audience, but I did feel that, Patrick, if you want to reply to Martin, since he took you on, please do so.
The period Martin referred to corresponds to the period Bob referred to. That was the late 60s through Watergate. It's a period of about 7 years. That was, had I unrolled my thesis more loquaciously, I would have mentioned that period. It was a very important period. Okay. One, during it, the stories that these two mentioned were possible because the orthodoxy was fractured. They would not have been possible before it. Afterward, in my very broad brush read, what the Washington Post accomplished in '74 sent the political and policy cliques in Washington into something near a panic. And the process that then ensued, reaching its first major sort of milestone of success, was Reagan, right? What happened after Reagan? The press, the book on all this is called On Bended Knee, right? The press knuckled under. And the period, these two gents, I honor that period very much. That's when I decided to become a hack, right? That was a really honorable thing to do then, right? Years later, I sort of slink out the other end, rather ashamed of my profession. But that period was important. It was an interim. It was not a contradiction of what I am talking about, the great arc, 1890s or so until today. We have what we have. If we had any different, we might not be having this conversation, I would have said. We would not have the term alternative media.
So I just want to thank Bob Perry for reminding us of what our founding fathers envisaged by way of a tough accountability press, and Patrick for reminding us how tough it is to have both empire and democracy. And Ray, my understanding is that the Committee on East-West Accord is not just a European committee, that there will be that it will be organized here in the spirit of the great words of Martin Luther King Jr. And Martin, maybe because you didn't reference the nation in that great litany of those media institutions disrupting and enlightening, I would simply say I agree with a lot of what you said, but when you begin to blame the American people, which I found echoes of in your references to the American education system, et cetera, I think the elite in this country, the media and political class elite, has far more blame on their shoulders, and I think any politics that blames the people, which, as we see from poll after poll, survey after survey, they're not interested in war with Russia, Ukraine. I think that's a politics that's kind of dead on arrival. But that aside, open it up to Q&A. A few questions there, and maybe we'll start with you, and if there are questions that follow on yours, we could group 2 or 3. Can you speak up? I'm sorry.
These blank spots in history, not just MH17, but the snipers. What major news media in this country has talked about Ivan Kaczyński's almost definitive study about the snipers? And why not? What about the slaughter in Odessa? It seems like Paul Robertson gave a very interesting speech, I guess, at the University of Ottawa in February, in which he talked about what has happened essentially is Ukraine has, not Russia by the way, Ukraine has gotten out in front of all these messages and essentially propagated lies, and the Western media has more or less gone along with it. I don't see any serious examination of these, and I really recommend everybody take a look at Kaczyński's paper. It's nearly definitive as far as who the snipers really were, and they weren't Yanukovych's police by any means. They were the other side. That's all.
The BBC had a report on that a couple of weeks back.
Quick comment. I'm a retired economist, and what I find very unsettling in some work I've done, we will become far more, we defer, professionals defer far more than, I don't like the word boss. In fact, the word boss is used so much more commonly than it was. But it's clear, when you listen to NPR, many of that sort, it's a remarkable
just wanted to say, based on your idea of the internet, that a bunch of us who've worked in Russia for over 10 years have formed a blog called RussiaOtherPointsOfView.com. All run together, all small, and I invite you all to both read it and also contribute to it. We'd be very happy to have you do that.
On the contrary, here's my question for you. This is the least read nation in the world. Number two, 500 of the leading 1,000 movies in the last 40 years all depict Russians as spies and some sort of thing. And at number three, in terms of just the movie, the biggest single impact in the United States are, at least under 49, are kids and adults going to movies. So the question for you guys is, I understand what you're doing. How do you attack those big, big numbers, given that literally 80% of this country is known as Mary and John Medico, as the intellectual group? So that's my question. What would you do?
Actually, I have an easy answer for that. In the 1960s, the two most popular and long-lasting, still reshown popular TV series, especially among kids and teenagers in the United States and around the world, were The Man from U.N.C.L.E. and then Star Trek. And they both had Russian heroes in extremely prominent positions who were not anti-communist or anti-Russian Russians. They were Russian Russians. Ilya Kuryakin, who was played in probably enough by David McCallum, whose extraordinary career 50 years later, he's now again in the most popular TV series in the world, an American patriotic show about naval cops, NCIS. Again, the most popular show on television. A very strong thematic message. And one of its sister shows, by the way, the show itself featured as one of its heroes an Israeli agent who was working with NCIS, played by actually a non-Jewish actress, very talented lady. And as you say, that the impact of these things in positive as well as negative ways is enormously. On Star Trek, the Starship Enterprise has a Russian officer from the second series onwards, Ensign Chekhov. The reason he came in was there was a nasty attack in Star Trek, a petty attack in a Soviet newspaper saying that Russia was pioneering space. First man in space was Yuri Gagarin, but the Americans didn't put this in. And Gene Roddenberry, who made the show, thought, that's right, we forgot this because we were Hollywood superficial, but let's get it right. So in the second series, they brought in Ensign Chekhov, and 50 years later, the character is still part of the franchise. So you're right, this is a positive way to go. Anyone here who has friends in Hollywood, let's get them to remake The Man from U.N.C.L.E. I mean, The X-Files is being remade.
Can I go at that another way? May I go at that another way? In the press community, there has been for some while a preoccupation with the devastating effect of new technologies. And basically, the craft sort of crumbled under our feet for those of us of a certain generation, right? That's so. But that's not really, that's just technological advances. They proceed as they will. There's another problem that journalists don't like to talk about, as far as I know, at all, and that is what they are putting in newspapers, right? There is an increasing sort of divorce between reality as apprehended by any paying attention person and what you read in the newspapers. That is why we have this very interesting phenomenon, the satirical news programs, right? What is going on in those programs? What is going on in those programs is the conveyance of the actual truth that cannot be in the newspapers, right? That's kind of, to make it's almost East European, right? So the question here is language, right? Look at the language of the so-called mainstream media. The compromise here is that they have adopted the language of the power centers they are supposed to be covering, right? That's a radical mistake. I think we will do ourselves a power of good if we learn to write in plain, simple language and say what is on our minds and in our best judgments, right? My first job was the Daily News. It was rather easy to make fun of the Daily News in those days as this. It was a damn well-written paper. It was a very well-written paper. Plain English, disciplined, clear sentences. So that is why you read it, you found it lying all over the construction sites of Manhattan and Brooklyn. It was readable. I think language is something we can do quite seriously. It might sound like a modest proposal, but I think it actually would make some difference, right? Writing in plain, simple language, and bluntly, clearly and bluntly, not badly, I'm not saying that, but bluntly. Young people, in my very limited experience, appreciate that.
Well, I want to thank Kat and the panel that we are now back on schedule. So we have like a final touch because we talked about alternative media today, and we have like a new boy in town. This new boy is here. He's son of the AP correspondent bureau chief in Moscow, and I think he came with some kind of a unexpected and pretty successful project. So I thought that maybe we'll give him just a few minutes to show exactly what's going on. Some of you probably already know this. It was mentioned. It's called Russia Insider. But this Charlie, I think I don't want to take too much time. The only announcement I want to make, when this is over, those who signed up for reception, there'll be a bus. I think I sent you email, but I can repeat. It's you take 2nd Street exit and go to the right. It's a corner Constitution Avenue in 2nd Street. There will be a bus. But only for those, of course, who signed up for reception and, first of all, speakers. I can't guarantee that all of you can get in, so we have to really yield to speakers, and then the rest can, and those who left behind, take a cab. Sorry about this, but this is what we could do. Now, Charles, let's go ahead.
Ed, thanks very much. You know, I cannot get my laptop working the way it was. So if you can find the person who changed it, I just need the... But anyway, I'll just go ahead and start, and I can certainly say a lot without the visuals. So I would say that you know, I'm coming with a message of optimism to what the folks on the panel were saying, that the situation is dire, and it comes from the world of alternative media. And in my experience, there is an enormous audience out there that is very sympathetic to the views that were expressed here today. And my experience in creating this site testifies that very strongly. So I would say if you put this message out there, you're going to get a lot of readers and a lot of viewers and a big audience. So an answer to your question is, what should we do? We should get the word out and put the word out, because people are responding. And I'll tell you the story of my site as an example of that. I'm an American businessman. I've been living on and off in Moscow, Russia for 25 years. I grew up in a journalistic family. I'm very familiar with the world of American journalism, have a lot of friends there. And for a long time I realized that the media coverage of Russia was inaccurate and was slanted and biased. And you know, it was a running joke actually among us finance people in Moscow because the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, The Economist, they would routinely publish these extremely pessimistic and negative articles about what a disaster Russia is, and you can't make money there, and you shouldn't invest, and so on and so forth. And we would do exactly the opposite and do extremely well. So we'd kind of join for beers afterwards and kind of laugh about the latest stupid article, totally ignore it, and go off and do what we knew was right. So it's been something that a lot of people have been aware of for a long time, this problem in the media, but it didn't seem like something that needed to be addressed. And then this past summer, when the Ukraine crisis broke, I felt very strongly that I just had to stand up and say something because things were getting scary. They were getting dangerous. So I and a couple of my like-minded colleagues, all non-Russians, we put up a little site that we thought would be read by about 200 of our friends, where we would just sort of let off some steam and sound off on some of the things we thought about Russia and about how the media was treating it. And what happened was people started volunteering. People started writing us and saying, hey, we love what you do. Can we also put something up? We got talked about in social media, and it was like this gradual sort of income of more and more people, volunteers. It grew bigger and bigger, and we realized, hey, this could turn into something more substantial. So we built a better website, and the thing just took off. And we had an enormous response from readers. And we launched in late September with the main site, and by Christmas, we were getting 70,000, 80,000 page views a day. And as of now, we cumulatively have over 20 million page views in exactly 6 months. And that's extraordinary because we didn't promote it, we didn't advertise it. We're not professional media people, we're not professional website people. This is something that just kind of happened on its own. And the interesting thing about all this is that it's growing. We're growing at about 20 to 30% a month, and we're getting an enormous number of volunteers from all over the world. Oh, okay. Well, did you do this? No? I can't, okay, all right, that's it. Well, anyway, so we're able to put out more and more headlines and more stories, and there doesn't seem to be any realistic limit to where this could go as of now. We just continue to, I'll give you an example. We've got about 60 people putting out this site. They're all over the world. And we get about 10 people a day who write us and say, hey, we'd like to join in, okay? That's 300 people a month. Now, we don't have the resources to handle all these people and give them things to do and manage them, but we certainly try. And so our team grows by, 10, 20, 30 people a month. And these are top-level people. These are people, oftentimes they're academics, they're retired diplomats, they're professional people, economists, financial people, lawyers, people who are capable of producing fantastic stuff. So what this really is, it's an example, it's citizen journalism in the real sense of the word. And also, it's important to understand that it's just really a volunteer collective effort. This doesn't have any sort of top-down management from me or other people who started this site. We have trouble sometimes controlling what goes up. Sometimes things go up and we sort of throw up our hands and say, oh no, and we rush to take it down. It's very chaotic. It's very democratic. And it's going to grow a lot. And it's gotten so big now that venture capital people are calling us and saying, hey, this really reminds us of Breitbart.com, how they got started. It really reminds us of Huffington Post. This is something that we would put money into because we see a success story when it's getting started. So it's very exciting, and it has a big future. And one of the things that we do is we benefit enormously from a lot of this alternative media that has sprung up. And it's sprung up in reaction to the media failure that has been discussed on this panel. And I'd like to mention some of the sites that we use a lot. It's a great big sort of sharing and cooperation project. One of them, probably the most prominent one, which many of you probably have heard of, is called Vineyard of the Sacker. And that's another interesting example. This guy got started writing a blog all by himself. And he started it about 1.5 years ago. And people liked so much what he was doing that they started volunteering and joining in. And he currently, I think it's now a group also of, 40 people or so, that put out this site in an amazing diversity of languages. I think they have 6 languages now, including Russian, German, French, Serbian, and I think I might be leaving something out. But I was talking to one of the guys who runs one of these language sites, the New Zealand version, and he said, I've got a team of 100 people who have volunteered to translate material for me, and they're all over the world. And I can just throw stuff out there and get a huge amount of stuff translated, video and so on. So, their experience parallels mine very much. But I could mention a lot of blogs. I was supposed to show all this on the video, but it's not working, so I'll just have to tell you about it. Another site that is very good is fortroos.com. We use a lot of material from there. There's a blog called The Moon of Alabama. Now, I have no idea who runs it. I get the feeling the guy's probably in Germany. But I would recommend that very much. We use that a lot. Help me, Ed. What are some of the other ones?
We'll send, I think, since we didn't show it,
Yeah.
we have emails of people, so we will send them all. Actually, some of those sites were listed in the program. So
Yeah,
you
a
can
lot of
send
them are listed on the program.
this in the program.
Now, I want to say something else which is very interesting. We also watch the German media. And we do that because a number of us can read and understand German. I myself am half German and speak fluent German. And what's interesting is that the Germans are way out ahead of the rest of the world in this department. It's absolutely fascinating. Their media has been the toughest and the hardest in terms of taking a hard line against Russia. And it's really kind of comical to watch it for a Westerner. You turn on the German TV and you see things you just would never fly for a Western audience, for an Anglo audience. Well, anyway, what's happened is it's created a backlash in Germany because the Germans didn't buy it either. And there's a whole cottage industry of alternative websites, blogs, associations, citizen action groups, and all sorts of things that are being extremely critical of the German media, way more than what we've been able to do. And it's not something that a lot of people know about, but it's important because Germany is an extremely important country in this equation, and there's a major, major movement going on there. People are filing lawsuits, people are protesting in the street, and there was an opinion poll taken by a major German TV station a couple months ago, to which the respondents answered a question, do you believe what the media is telling you about what is happening in Ukraine? And 63% of Germans said no. No, we don't. Now that is a PR failure, and that's a propaganda failure, and that's a media failure. They've lost the trust of the people there. To another question they answered, tell us how much trust you have in the media in general. And there was a lot, some, sort of, or none at all. 15% of people answered none at all, 0. You've totally lost us. So just an interesting little insight. It's something else that's going on, and we cover it and write about it. Let's see. I think that covers it. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Yeah.
My name is Kendrick White. I'm Vice President for the Lovachevsky University of Nizhny Novgorod. Most of the world looks at Russia and just sees news about the oil, commodities, natural resources, and all the negative things we all know about. There is actually a thriving development of the innovation economy. And I'm part of a university which is collecting data from about 150 other partners around the country on news releases, what's happening on the innovation economy, developments on creating new drugs, new solutions. So I think if that information is interesting, that's actually out there and that's available for people to look at. So, I'm happy to introduce you to that to get that into Russian Insight.
I would be delighted. I would be delighted. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
I'm sorry for this computer problem, but we have about run out of time. I want to thank, of course, all our speakers. I think we had a great time today, and hopefully we had some media, so maybe it will be spread around. And again, those who signed up for reception, please take exit 2nd Street, turn right, and you'll see the bus in the corner, Constitution Avenue in 2nd Street, Northeast. I can't guarantee we'll take everyone, but the speakers have priority, and then whatever space is left. Otherwise, just take a cab. I'll see you at the embassy. Thank you so much. Thank you.